We're joined once again by Emma Donoghue, playwright, literary historian, and novelist. This is the second installment in our four-part look at gender and family issues. We want to talk about an early part of the formation of self-identity, and that is gender. Tomorrow, we'll focus on masculinity and gender, but tonight, we are looking at women. Hi again.
Hello.
In many reviews of your writing, Emma, you're referred to as a lesbian author. Even when you're not writing about that in the context of your books, like in Room, for example, which has no lesbian theme in it at all. How do you feel about that label?
Well, you know, if I was a Jamaican author, I wouldn't mind being called a Jamaican author, even on occasions when my book is set in New York. So I just see it as a where I'm from label. It doesn't in any way limit what I'm allowed to write about, you know.
You write a lot of historical fiction, and how much do you research gender identity in the pursuit of creating female characters?
I research a lot, and with historical fiction you have to be very careful not to be anachronistic by sticking a modern mindset onto your, say, 18th century heroine. I mean, you can certainly choose an 18th century girl who was more spunky and ahead of her time than some of her peers, but you still shouldn't give her the whole set of modern values. For instance, when I wrote a novel about an 18th century prostitute, I made her quite ambitious, but she was not aware of how she should be in solidarity with all the other downtrodden people, for instance. So in the household where she was working, there was a character who was a slave and wasn't getting paid anything. And, you know, the main character is only mildly bothered by that. She doesn't naturally see that, you know, black people and women and disabled people should all work together. So you have to really avoid any sort of PC-ness.
18th century prostitute, you've written about modern day women as well. How has the language we use to describe the female gender changed, well, over a long period of time?
Well, that's a good point. There are certain words, I'm thinking, say, of one novel I did about a late 18th century sculptor, as we would call her now, but in her day she would have been known as a sculptress, which of course has a very different overtone. I know lots of women who work in theatre, they want to be known as actors, not actress, because a lot of these words with S on the end, you know, they have faintly trivial overtones, as if the woman is just, you know, like a cocktail waitress, just passing time while waiting for the man to sweep her off her feet. So you have to be very careful with the gender in your language, yeah, and yet you have to use the flavoursome words of the day. You can't try and, you know, erase the politics that's built into the language. I mean, you know, the language in the 18th century always implied that for instance, poor people were literally the lower classes, and similarly with women, they always implied that the male was the norm.
Do you think that we've gone too far, though, in sort of trying to take the female out of the female, if I can put it that way?
It's funny. I think often there are official words that maybe you're meant to use if you work on radio or TV, but at the everyday level, I noticed my daughter the other day, she referred to our letter carrier as the postman, even though she's a woman. So I thought, okay, my daughter has clearly not picked up the phrase letter carrier. She's saying postman, even though she knows that person is female. So I think often the popular language is quite resistant to these efforts to clean it up and make it more correct.
But is it too far? I mean, should we just accept that postmen, whether they're men or women, it's a title known as postman, or do you think we should fight to change it?
I think when you, if you take a more important example, premier, you know, a premier makes any girl feel that she perhaps could be the premier of Ontario, whereas if the word was, you know, government man, I'm sure my daughter might not feel she was able to become the premier. So yeah, I think the language does help, but it takes a few generations to change.
I want to get you to read something. It's from an introduction note to your edited literary collection, Inseparable. Why don't you go ahead and read part of that?
Sure. When I found myself falling for a girl at 14, I began seeking out stories of desire between women. The first such title I spent my hoarded pocket money on was a truly grim Dutch novel published in 1975, Harry Mulish's Twee Vrouwen, in English, Two Women. Sylvia leaves Laura for Laura's ex-husband Alfred, but it turns out only to get pregnant. The two women are blissfully reunited for a single evening of planning the nursery decor before Alfred turns up and shoots Sylvia dead, leaving Laura to jump out a window. Shaken but not dissuaded, I read on for the next 20 years and counting. You would be forgiven for thinking that my book list must have been rather short, but the paradox is that writers in English and other Western languages have been speaking about this so-called unspeakable subject for the best part of a millennium.
If that's true, if romantic relationships between women have been written about for ages in literature, Why has it taken us so long for lesbian fiction to gain recognition and perhaps even more so, mainstream respect?
Well, one funny thing is that it often gets read as something else. You know, Shakespeare fills his plays with plots in which women fall for each other either by mistake if one of them is dressed as a man, or under the rubric of friendship, passionate friendship, like the two women who don't want to be parted in As You Like It. So basically, if it's in a cross-dressing story, it gets read as, oh, that's just heterosexual desire in a mistaken form. And if it's in a friendship story, it gets read as, oh, they're just great buddies. Even though, you know, the central plot of As You Like It is one girl refusing to be parted from another. Similarly, even if you get a more overtly lesbian storyline, like in, say, Henry James's novel, The Bostonians, critics will say, oh, it's a great novel, and therefore it's not a lesbian novel. No, no, it's a novel about something else. It's a novel about gender. It's a novel about society. So people feel that the lesbian label is very limiting, and so they go to great lengths to call any book they like not a lesbian novel.
Are we at that point where we can get away from this kind of labeling?
I think it is improving, yeah. I think people are rather more able to just deal with the story as it comes up. One thing I find very heartening is that very often, well, I would say writers like myself who happen to be gay or lesbian, we always write about straight relationships too. We wouldn't attempt to keep our writing to, you know, that particular slice of society. But a lot of heterosexual novelists now include some gay or lesbian characters or storylines. I'm thinking of, say, Jonathan Franzen's, why am I going blank on the name? Not Freedom, the big one before that. The Corrections, that's right, yeah. There was a storyline in The Corrections where a woman gets involved with a man and a woman at the same time. So, or another writer, say the British writer Julian Barnes, he's written an exquisite short story about two English women going to France and setting up, buying a vineyard together. So I think it's very, very healthy when people write across these sexuality lines. And it means that the labels don't hold firm at all.
You know, but some literary critics have said that literature provides this safe space for society to deal with unspeakable gender topics. Do you agree with that?
That does actually make sense, that people would be more willing to read a novel about something than to deal with it in a more concrete way. Yeah, I think novels, for instance, often push an issue many decades before the law will change. So I do think they prepare people mentally and they allow them to explore things in the safety of the quiet reading relationship.
What do you think is still unspeakable about female gender identity in literature?
It's not so much that any of it is unspeakable, but it still tends to be seen as a real minority pursuit, you know? There's this idea that lesbian and gay issues are only of interest to lesbian and gay people, and that it's a little subsection of a subsection. Whereas, you know, I can respond passionately to the story of Romeo and Juliet, so I don't see why a man living with a woman would fail to respond to a story of two women in love. I don't think that readers need to stay in those little boxes, and I think publishers are often a bit fearful of just marketing a same-sex storyline to the broadest possible audience.
It's risky though, right?
It depends how you do it, you know. It depends on the book too, because I mean, some same-sex stories are written very much for our little community, but others are written very much in a universalizing kind of spirit, like, here's a story you want to know about. This is a story for anybody. So I think if you write with that kind of confidence, and if your publishers have the courage to say this is a story that could be of interest to anyone, then it does actually get you past those mental barriers that some readers may have erected.
In your first chapter of Inseparable, you speak of women feeling confounded or confused by their love for one another. What does that say about female identity?
Well, I suppose, to make a gross generalization, most women have been raised to think that they are there to fit in with men, you know, to marry men, to perhaps do the housework while men have the careers, to raise the children for the men. I mean, most women are raised on that premise. And so to realize that your life is going to take a different direction and that you might end up living with a woman instead of a man, I mean, it can be a shock at a personal level, and a lot of communities have trouble with that. I mean, when I was growing up in Catholic Ireland, it's not so much that anyone said anything nasty about homosexuality, they did not refer to it at all. It was a loud silence. So, you know, at 14, I certainly felt like a complete freak, and that can happen in many different settings today, even where on paper many countries look like they've got quite good laws. I think a lot of girls are still shocked and horrified to feel that they might have a life that doesn't base itself around a man.
How common do you think that is for young women in this country there's so many good laws about that stuff? How common do you think
it's
that is?
less common, and I think girls in particular, more than boys, may be a little bit relaxed about the idea that their desires might go in either direction. I think girls are less panic-stricken by desire for girls than boys can be about desire for boys. I think there's a bigger taboo about gay sex, basically. There's more of a panic. It's as if everything that involves a penis is more of a big deal. You know, so there's still the idea that, oh, two girls together, nothing's really happening, so nobody need worry. You know, a lot of straight men find the idea quite appealing, whereas the idea of two boys together suddenly makes everybody panic.
The theme of unveiling and self-discovery is very central to your works that explore gender. What interests you about that, pulling back the layers?
Well, it fascinates me that you might have a certain idea about yourself and then you're gradually forced to change that idea. And sexuality is only one of the subjects that could make you rethink yourself in that way. I mean, it can happen in terms of, say, nationality as well. I mean, I grew up thinking I'm an Irish woman, I'll always be Irish, and here I find myself a Canadian, you know. These things creep up on you. Before I moved to Canada, I had barely heard of Canada, so, you know, we can all end up moving to strange territory in our lives. Parenthood is another one. You know, my partner never expected to have kids, actively didn't want to have kids, and, you know, she often jokes with me now about how did this happen, you know. She's ended up with two kids she adores. So I'm always fascinated by characters who are going through a transition like that.
Writers learn a lot about themselves through their own writing. And what have you learned about female identity through your years of writing?
I'm very interested in the flexibility of, for instance, sexuality. We've all known people who thought they were one thing and ended up as another. You know, I've known women who spent their 20s with women, ended up with a man, and vice versa. In the lesbian world, we often call them has-beens, has-been lesbians. So, you know, the joking helps. It takes the sting out of it, you know, oh, we've lost one, damn. Yeah, I like those moments of unexpected change. And I'm certainly trying to raise my kids with a completely open-minded, like, whenever I say to them something like, oh, you know, when you're grown up, you might marry someone, a man or a woman. You know, I always put it in totally neutral terms so that they don't have that sense that they either, you know, have to be queer because I am, or else have to be straight in order to prove to the neighbours that we haven't warped them. You know, I really want them to grow up not worrying about these things at all.
Your writing also often talks about women, despite the time in which they live, about pushing boundaries of what's acceptable in society. How has that sense of what's normal for women influenced the way that women portray themselves?
Well, I'm thinking, for instance, of one of my main characters in my novel, The Sealed Letter. She set up a printing press, and where she entered into the historical record, the reason she's in my novel is that she got dragged into this mucky divorce case in terms of her friendship with the wife in the divorce case. And there were all these implications that maybe she and the wife were lovers. But I think this character, Emily Faithfull, she was already marked out as unusual because she was setting up a printing press to provide jobs for women. So I think often you get that kind of breaking of rules at the career level alongside a breaking of rules at the personal level. And it's very interesting that, for instance, in her case, she was in a very, you know, conscious little feminist movement known as the Langham Place movement. They were the sort of first generation of English feminists. And when she got you know, written up in the newspapers in terms of her friendship with this scandalous wife in the divorce case, her feminist sisters completely dropped her. They would have nothing more to do with her because even though they were determined to fight the good fight in terms of jobs for women, they felt they couldn't dare break any rules at the personal level, so they completely disowned her. And I think you see that in some other movements too. We
have just about 1 minute left, but I want to end by asking you this. What do you think the attention to lesbian fiction has done for gender identity expression broadly, at large?
I think it's liberating for everybody because it raises issues such as, you know, clothing, you know, why certain girls want to wear tomboyish clothes, other ones want to wear frilly clothes, and that this doesn't in any way neatly correlate with who they're going to end up desiring. I think in a way, it makes life a bit freer for everybody because even if you're heterosexual, you still want to be able to act that out in a way that suits you. You don't want to have to sort of follow the expected social program.
Emma Donoghue, thank you for this conversation. We'll continue it tomorrow.
Thanks.